Okay, good afternoon. This is Mrs. Harrison, and I am going to go through the evidence for evolution notes. Um, and so I'm just going to just start. By now you guys should know that Charles Darwin is like the father of evolution. But before Darwin came along, people thought that organisms were unchanging, they weren't related. They also thought that the earth was really young, only 6,000 years old. Charles Darwin was the first scientist to propose the theory of evolution by means of natural selection. And hopefully you guys know what that means. Hopefully you know about that phrase. You've watched the mechanisms of evolution notes. But let me just kind of review. So basically, natural selection just means that the organisms that are best adapted to their environment will be able to survive and reproduce and pass on those adaptations to their offspring. Okay, so Charles Darwin, he transformed our understanding of the living world. He believed that all species were descended from ancient ancestors. So it's kind of like the tree of life, like all organisms are related. All right, so initially his ideas were met with criticism and skepticism. However, nowadays the theory of evolution is widely accepted as the unifying theme of biology. And it's very important. And so anytime you have a theory in science, there has to be evidence that supports that theory. And so we're just going to kind of go through the evidence that we have that supports the theory of evolution. Okay, so scientists use four main pieces of evidence in order to draw conclusions about evolutionary relationships. Those four pieces of evidence are: one, the fossil record; two, anatomical structures; three, molecular or biochemical composition; and then finally, embryological development. Okay, so the first piece of evidence that we have that support the theory of evolution is the fossil record. And fossils, just to review, are the preserved remains of trace impressions of a previously living organisms. So we know that there are organisms that were once living on this earth that are no longer here because of the fossils that we have found. And so these right here, these are two examples of fossils. All right, so fossils, the age of fossils can be determined by two ways: relative dating and absolute dating. Relative dating is when you just look at the fossil and where it's found in the sedimentary rock. So many times sedimentary rock, there are layers. And so the fossils that are found in the top layers are younger than the fossils found in the bottom layers. And so that's one way that we can date fossils, by just looking at which layer the fossil has been found in. Another way we can date fossils is by measuring the isotopes in the rock and how much the isotopes have decayed. And that is absolute dating. So when you do this, you get an actual number. So you can find out, okay, this fossil is 50 million years old by looking at the isotopes in the rock or in the fossil and measuring how much decay that isotope has done. All right, so there are documents. So the fossil record documents the existence of extinct species. So like I said before, we know looking at the fossils that there are organisms that used to live on this earth that no longer live on this earth. And so that allows us to draw conclusions about the evolutionary history of living organisms. And so evolutionary history, the vocabulary word for evolutionary history is phylogeny. All right, and so the second piece of evidence that scientists look at is anatomical structures. And so scientists compare the morphology or just like the body structure, anatomical, anatomy has to do with the body. And so when scientists are looking at anatomical structures, they are looking at the bones and the makeup of those bones. And they can look at different structures and draw conclusions about how organisms are related based on those different structures. So the more similarities in morphology or body structure, the closer the relationship. All right, so there are three types of anatomical evidence: homologous structures, analogous structures, and vestigial structures. And so homologous structures are structures that are that have the same anatomy. Homo means same. And so these structures have the same anatomy, or the bones are put together in the same way, but the function may be different. So these structures suggest that these organisms have a close evolutionary relationship and that they have a recent common ancestor. So these are homologous structures, and you can see that the human, the cat, the whale, and the bat, they all have these same bones. They have a humerus bone, a radius, ulna, carpals, metacarpals, and so forth. So these are homologous structures, and these lead us to believe that these organisms are related. All right, and so another piece of anatomical structure or anatomical evidence are analogous structures. Analogous are structures that have different anatomy, so they are kind of put together in a different way, but they may have a similar function or the same function. So for example, the wings of a butterfly and the wings of a bat. Both of those organisms use those wings to fly, but they are not anatomically similar. So the wing structure of a butterfly is a lot different than the wing structure of a bat. So this tells us that these organisms don't share a recent common ancestor, and they are not closely related. Another piece of anatomical evidence are vestigial structures. And vestigial structures are structures that no longer serve a purpose in the organism. So why are they there? Well, maybe the ancestors used those structures. And so these structures allow us to draw conclusions about the past history of a species. So examples of vestigial structures are the pelvis bones in the whale. And whales don't have legs. So why do they have a pelvis bones or the remnants of a pelvis bones? Well, scientists believe that whales have evolved from organisms that lived on land, so their ancestors had legs. Another example of a vestigial structure are wisdom teeth in humans. So we have some people get wisdom teeth, they get them pulled out. We don't need our wisdom teeth. And so scientists believe that our ancestors because the diet that we ate, we probably needed those teeth back in the day, but now we no longer need them. Another example of a vestigial structure is your appendix. So your appendix has no purpose, but scientists believe that maybe in the past, our ancestors needed that appendix to help digest the food that we used to eat. Another piece of evidence for evolution is molecular evidence. And when we talk about molecular evidence, we are talking about molecules, chemicals. So molecular, biochemical, same thing. And so when we're looking at molecular evidence, we're just looking at like molecules like DNA or protein or RNA. And so the more similarities in the DNA, the more closely related an organism is, and the more recent common ancestor those two organisms have. So like, for example, right here in this example, it says, what percent of your genes do you share? And so we share 98% of our genes with a chimp. 92% of our genes are similar to those of a mouse. But then if you look at a plant, only 18% of our genes in humans are the same as those in a plant. So we can look at these these molecular evidence, and we can determine, okay, so humans must be more closely related to chimps than to like yeast or to plants. So the more similar the molecules, the more closely related organisms are. And so here's another example. So we're looking at, it says comparison of hemoglobin, which is a protein in blood. So it's looking at the number of amino acid differences. So like the number of amino acid differences between a human and a gorilla for the hemoglobin is only 1. Rhesus monkey is 8. If you look at the frog, it's 67 differences in this molecule. And so we can see that humans are more closely related to gorillas than they are to frogs based on looking at the similarities of this hemoglobin molecule. So some biological molecules that we look at for molecular evidence are we look at DNA sequences, RNA sequences, protein structure, and amino acid sequences. So the more similar the molecules, the more closely related those organisms are. And then finally, we can look at embryology to determine relationships, evolutionary relationships. And so embryology is just a study of how organisms develop. And so similarities in develop will let us know, more similarities in embryology, the more closely related or the more recent common ancestor those two organisms have. So if you look at this top line, you can see that you can't really tell the difference between like a fish or a human. Like all the organisms here look very similar at that very earliest stage of development. And then as you go down, you can see that you definitely see the differences in these organisms. But these the second line, the second row, is still very similar, or a lot of similarities between like the embryo of a human and embryo of a rabbit. It look very similar. And so that is all for this, for these notes. Since I do have a couple of minutes, I do want to pull up some practice. And we can just kind of go through a couple of examples of practice. Okay, so let's look at this right here. And so this one is done. This first one is done for you. It says humans and dolphins have the same bone structure making up their arms and fins. This is an example of which form of anatomical evidence for evolution. Remember, there are 3 pieces of anatomical evidence. And so this would be an example of homologous structures because remember, homo means the same. And so if they have the same anatomy, then those are homologous structures. Let's look at number 1. It says smack dab in the middle of Tennessee, scientists discovered the preserved remains of an aquatic animal that no longer exists today. This is an example of which form of evidence for evolution. So we said in the notes that preserved remains of organisms are what? Okay, so that would be fossil. So this right here would be fossil record evidence. It says, give an example of something scientists can conclude from this particular piece of evidence. So we said that fossil evidence just gives scientists clues as to how the organisms have changed over time. And it also gives us clues as to organisms that used to live on Earth that no longer live on Earth. Okay, let's look at number 2. So it says the human gene sequence for muscle protein differs from the muscle protein gene sequence in monkeys in 4 places. It differs from the muscle protein gene sequence in chicken in 25 places. This is an example of which form of evidence for evolution. Okay, so we're looking at molecules. Muscle protein, that's a molecule. And so what type of evidence would that be? All right, so if you pick molecular evidence, then you are correct. All right, so I think my time is running out. And so I'm going to end this video right now. Oops, did not mean to do that. But if you have any other questions, then let me know, email me. But hopefully this video was helpful for you. Okay, have a good day.